country under the First Amendment, words of hate, no matter how odious, are not only tolerated, but protected. But after violent incidents like the Oklahoma City bombing and abortion clinic shootings, some argue that the First Amendment, which was meant to protect dissent, is instead protecting hate.
So is it time then to consider limiting hate rhetoric? Or should we be fighting harder than ever to protect its right to exist? Well, joining us now from Washington, D.C. is Amitai Etzioni. He's an author of The Spirit of Community and professor of sociology at George Washington University. And from Spokane, Washington, Nadine Strawson, president of the American Civil Liberties Union. And thank you both for being with us this morning. Well, Ms. Strawson, when Americans look at these incidents like Oklahoma City, like what goes on at abortion clinics, I suppose it raises the question of whether or not by protecting free speech as strongly as we do, we're not creating a safe house for hate.
Kevin, it's very important to draw the distinction between protecting somebody's right to say something, including hate-filled messages, and on the other hand, agreeing that that is an appropriate thing to say. I draw, as does the law in this country, a bright line between censoring speech, that is government suppression, and that is unconstitutional, and on the other hand, censuring or criticizing speech. I completely agree with President Clinton's remarks after the Oklahoma City tragedy that those of us who defend freedom of speech, including himself, including for the hate speech that he said created or contributed to the climate of violence in this country, he said precisely because we defend freedom of speech, we have a great responsibility to raise our own voices, to exercise our own freedom of speech, to criticize the ideas and the hate mongers for using their expression in the way they do. And that's what I think the appropriate response is.
So the classic argument that good speech will drown out the bad speech.
Exactly.
Professor Etzioni, would you suggest that in some way we need to limit speech in this country?
Well, we already do. Even the ACLU agrees that you shouldn't shout fire in a crowded theater unless there is a fire. And so obviously there are some words which we are not allowed to use. We will not, we have, in addition to these legal limitations, we have policy in place. There are certain things, if I would say here this morning, I will never be invited back. There would be a non-stop scandal on my campus. In the Senate, if you offend somebody, you're made to apologize. There are many steps we can take short of changing the law by having policies in place that we all have the same purpose. They will communicate like one person that certain forms of speech which lead to killing very directly are not acceptable. The stronger we are on this, the less people find a gain in speaking that way. More will return to a civil conversation.
But that's an example of why we do not need censorship, because we already have community pressure. For example, your excellent lead-in story showed the town in Virginia where the citizens, the voters, rebelled against hateful rhetoric. It did not pay off. It helped the candidate who used it lose the election. So that kind of answering speech we dislike by exercising our right to vote against candidates who engage in that kind of speech is a classic example of how we can use free speech to drown out hate speech. I have to say I completely agree with Amitai that if, for example, what we had was an actual threat, that would in fact constitute punishable speech, even though it is accomplished by words. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the vague rhetoric that has always been part of a robust political discourse in this country as well as in Israel.
But I'm wondering whether that discourse, though, is now at such a level that it may not be able to be drowned out by the good speech as easily. I mean, we have all these examples of information being passed on the internet. Mr. Strawson, why don't you address that, whether or not there are levels of hate speech in this country that aren't so easily drowned out by, acceptable speech?
Well, actually, the internet is a classic example of why more speech is becoming more and more effective a response. The internet is giving access literally to everybody in the world to reach everybody else in the world. And in fact, although what they call flaming and very, hateful rhetoric abounds, answers to it also abound.
But Ms. Strawson, some would also suggest that because we do have these new methods of technologies, we have these fax networks, we have the internet, that systems of checks and balances, which you suggest do work so well, have not had time to develop and to be parallel in strength to the strength of the hate speech that's being sent out over these new technologies.
Well, actually, that's not in fact correct. There are many famous examples of, people hurling just vicious epithets over the internet, and yet the communities there are self-policing. They'll throw people out of bulletin boards, out of chat rooms, if they use words that are grossly insulting and inconsistent with the level of discourse that community, that virtual community, sets for itself.
Mr. Etzioni, what do you think about that? Do you think there are enough checks and balances on this that free speech is protected?
They are not, and we already established that there is, quote, punishable speech, and so we're now just arguing about exactly where to draw the line.
Well, how do you draw the line? I mean, who draws the line in this?
The line is where the words get close to action. When we have people meeting in a basement to conspire to commit a crime, they didn't do anything but talk, that's punishable by law. When we have on internet mayhem manuals, 69 pages, telling you how to make a bomb, where to place it, to make it more dangerous, that is too close to action. So when words get that close to vile, dangerous assassinations, that's the place to stop them. And I would think when a rabbi blesses and legitimates a killer, that's the time to stop and not wait till the bullet has been shot.
Professor, I have to cut you off. Clearly this is a debate that will continue. Thank you very much. And we'll be back right after this.